All right. Can you hear me okay? Does it sound?
They have separate. So filming is a totally separate microphone. It's just whether they can.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm sorry to interrupt all the good conversation. So my name is Melissa Gregory, and are we okay? I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters at the University of Toledo, and I'd like to welcome you to the annual Philip Markowicz Lecture in Judaism and Jewish Biblical Studies, which is supported by the Jewish Federation and Foundation of Greater Toledo. To those of you who are here in the Center for Performing Arts Recital Hall with us, thank you for being a part of our live audience. And to those of you who are joining us online, thank you for participating in our live stream. And it's so nice to see everyone here tonight. I'm sorry it's always a little chilly in the Center for the Performing Arts. I don't know if you knew, we are in, the Department of Music is an all Steinway department. And so behind those doors are two very beautiful works of art, two full grand Steinway pianos, and they require it very cold. So we keep it chilly for the Steinways. So my thanks also to the Department of Music for providing this space for us tonight, and to the Department of Communication for providing our online viewers with live access. So my job tonight is to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Barry Jackisch, who is the Philip Markowicz Endowed Professor in Judaism and Jewish Biblical Studies. The Markowicz Endowed Professorship is named after Philip Markowicz. And before I introduce Dr. Jackisch here, I'd like to pause just a moment and share a little about Philip Markowicz, the remarkable man for whom this professorship is named. Philip Markowicz was born in a small town in Poland in 1924 as the son of a rabbi. He became a Talmud prodigy and grew up in a loving family filled with tradition and religion. His life was shattered when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. After Philip's father became a target of Nazi persecution, his family fled their village for the larger city of, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Loch? Sort of, close enough. However, the family was soon moved into that city's infamous ghetto. Of Philip's large pre-war family, only Philip and his brother Henry survived the ghetto. From there, the brothers were sent on to Auschwitz and a series of other Nazi concentration camps. Philip spent the last days of World War II on a death march that few others survived. After the war, Philip met and married his wife Ruth in a displaced persons camp in Germany. They eventually moved to the United States and settled in Toledo, Ohio, where Philip created a thriving business in electronics, Phil's TV and appliance, and raised a loving family with 3 children. Philip continued his passion for Torah study and wrote extensively in his retirement. He published an autobiography, My 3 Lives, in 2010, and completed the manuscript for his second book, Losing God in Translation, shortly before he passed away in 2017. Both books were published by and are available from the University of Toledo Press. And now to our speaker, Dr. Barry Jackisch, the current Markowicz Endowed Professor. Dr. Jackisch received his bachelor's degree in history and German from Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, and his master's and Ph.D. in history from the State University of New York at Buffalo. He currently works as an associate professor of history at the University of Toledo. Dr. Jackisch is a historian of modern Germany and Central and Eastern Europe, with research interests related to democracy, fascism, and communism in the mid-20th century, and he has 1 book and multiple articles and has presented in both Europe and North America in those areas. At the University of Toledo, he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in modern German and Russian history, war and revolution in Europe, the history of the Holocaust and comparative genocide, and the contemporary world. In 2024, Jackisch received a grant from the Ohio Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission to develop a minor in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Toledo, which was recently approved and will be in the catalog, I believe, in the fall, correct? Dr. Jackisch's talk tonight is entitled Berlin's New Synagogue, A Historical Appreciation, 1850 to the Present. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barry Jackisch.
Nice to see everyone here this evening. Thank you all for coming. I don't know what's worse, having really bad weather and it makes you want to be inside and so you show up, or having beautiful sunny weather and it's easier to drive. I'm never quite sure how that works. But in any case, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it and look forward to some questions and some discussion in the time that we have afterward, okay? I'd like to begin this evening by thanking the Markowicz family for making this event possible. Their generosity is a true testimony to the namesake of this sponsorship, Philip Markowicz, and his remarkable life and accomplishments as a devoted family man, religious scholar, local business person, and Holocaust survivor. My thanks also go to the Jewish Federation and Foundation of Greater Toledo, and the College of Arts and Letters, and its dean, Melissa Gregory. On September 5th, 1866, an important event in the life of Berlin took place. Amid an assembled crowd of thousands, including then Prussian Minister-President Otto von Bismarck, Berlin's mayor and police president, leading members of the city assembly and the Prussian court, Berlin's Jewish community, which at that time numbered about 28,000, which was about 4% of the city's total, gathered to dedicate what would come to be known as the New Synagogue, or in German, Neue Synagoge. The event was front-page news in many local papers. Located on the Oranienburger Straße in the so-called Mitte district in the city center, the beautiful new building featured a front 92 feet wide, a length of 308 feet, a width of 126 feet, and a main dome reaching 160 feet high with a capacity of 3,200 worshipers. On many levels, this building was a triumph for the city's Jewish community. One Berlin newspaper called the new synagogue, quote, one of Berlin's major ornaments, unquote. The front page of another publication wrote, quote, the new house of worship is the pride of the Jewish community of Berlin, but even more, it is a gift to the city. One of the most remarkable creations of modern architecture in the Moorish style, and one of the most distinguished construction projects that the northern German royal capital has carried out in recent years, unquote. Given the long and complicated history of Berlin's Jewish community, these public accolades marked an important milestone, not only of Jewish accomplishment, but also acknowledgement of the Jewish community as an important part of the city of Berlin. To be sure, not everyone agreed with these glowing assessments. More on that a bit later. But whatever the viewpoint, no one could deny that the new synagogue's dedication marked a major moment in the city's development. My talk tonight will explore certain aspects of the historical and cultural significance of this building in both the Jewish and more generally the history of Berlin. I hope to use the remarkable history of the new synagogue to help us better understand aspects of the history of Berlin's Jewish population in the context of Germany's complex development in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indeed, this building has a remarkable history and is still today a key part of Berlin's urban skyline. While a small active synagogue was reestablished in 1998 on site, the building itself is better known today as a museum and remembrance site and a major stop for tourists and everyone interested in learning more about one of Berlin's most important structures. My talk tonight will have three parts. First, I will provide a general overview of the history of Jews in Berlin up to the dedication of the synagogue, then move on to provide an overview of the synagogue's history before offering a few general comments on the historical importance of this structure and its ongoing contribution to the evolution of Berlin. Berlin's Jewish history is nearly as old as the city itself, with the first documented reference coming in 1295 in a directive forbidding the city's weavers from buying yarn from Jewish merchants. In one short document, we can confirm that Jews already lived in Germany's future capital city, and also that some of the deep prejudices that led to their persecution were already present in the 13th century. By 1575, the city's Jews had faced disease, deprivation, and multiple pogroms, culminating in their total expulsion by 1580. It would be nearly a century before they would return and establish a successful and growing community. This occurred in 1671 when the Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm I invited in 50 Jewish families after they had been driven out of Vienna. These refugees were bound by an edict that stipulated where they could live in the city and forbade them from building any kind of synagogue. Worship was to take place in private homes. By 1750, the number had expanded to almost 180 families and would continue to grow from there. In spite of this, Jewish existence in Berlin until well into the 19th century was severely limited by a range of discriminatory laws and regulations which kept Jews in a decidedly second-class status, denying them full citizenship in spite of their contributions to the political, economic, and cultural growth of the Prussian state. In spite of this generally discriminatory environment, one important exception in the early 18th century should be noted. The original edict on a public Jewish worship space eased, and in 1714, Berlin's first community synagogue was officially dedicated in the Heiderreutergasse near the center of the Old City. Actually, the old location of the old synagogue and this synagogue I'll talk about tonight, they're quite close to each other at one point. This building was labeled as the Great Synagogue in contrast to other smaller worship rooms that had developed in private residences. And these are two drawings, and you can see the outside of the building there on the left, and then the inside as well. More on that in a second. Because of strict construction codes governing building height at the time, the builders excavated an underground section that allowed for a larger overall interior space. With the later founding of the new synagogue in 1866, the one that I'm going to talk about tonight, this original Heiderreutergasse building became known as the Old Synagogue. Sadly, it would not survive partial destruction from the Nazi attack on Berlin's Jews during Kristallnacht in November of 1938 and the extensive bombing during World War II. Today, near a small park, a historical plaque is the only reminder of the old synagogue's existence on its original site. Beyond the building of the old synagogue, and in spite of ongoing anti-Jewish restrictions, the Enlightenment era of the 18th and early 19th century witnessed the development of a vibrant Jewish cultural and intellectual scene in Berlin. Featuring prominent representatives like Moses Mendelssohn, this movement was part of the broader Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, which shaped life in much of Central and Eastern Europe in this period. A key part of this movement was a growing debate about the status of Jews in Berlin and the Kingdom of Prussia. And it posed a basic question. Could Jews become full citizens to be known simply as, quote, Germans of the Jewish faith, unquote? By the revolutionary era of 1848 and after, this question was answered, at least legally, in the affirmative. The new Prussian Constitution of 1850 declared citizenship regardless of religion for all Prussians, and the Constitution of the newly unified German nation later on in 1871 affirmed the status of Jews in Germany as citizens. While legally binding, this hardly ended other forms of social and bureaucratic discrimination, and in fact unleashed new forces of hate from individuals and groups that refused to accept Jews as full citizens. As we will now see in considering the history of the new synagogue, the legacy of this hate would have significant consequences in the 20th century. The background story of the new synagogue in Berlin can best be understood in the broader context of the city's growing Jewish population. By the 1850s, community leaders decided that the city's existing old synagogue needed substantial renovation. This took place under the guidance of renowned Berlin architect Edward Knobloch, who also built the new synagogue. In spite of Knobloch's renovations, which added slightly to the building's total capacity, it had become clear that the new worship space was needed, especially with large numbers of worshipers during the holidays. In 1857, a new synagogue commission was formed. The Jewish community had purchased a large plot of land at Oranienburger Straße 30, again in central Berlin. An architectural competition was arranged for the new building, and Edward Knobloch took over the design and construction. And here is a side picture from, on the left, looking from the Oranienburger Straße toward the front of the synagogue. You can see how relative to its overall size, how narrow, relatively narrow it is on the street-facing side. And then very interestingly, you'll see the Great Hall, basically the back of the synagogue there, is turned at an angle because the lot that they purchased had existing buildings there, and so they basically had to try to fit the new synagogue into the space that the lot provided. One of the key difficulties lay in the fact that the lot was narrow facing the street and slightly angled. So in this sense, the particular features of the lot itself largely dictated the overall layout of the synagogue, including its relatively narrow facade and deep angled Great Hall bordered on all sides by private buildings. By July 1861, the topping out ceremony celebrated the completion of the building's exterior and the prominent dome. Synagogue Commission members, Edward Knobloch, the architect, and key community representatives all attended this event. The head of the commission, Karl Heimann, gave a speech on that occasion that encapsulated the position of many within the Jewish community at that time. Scholars had made clear that the new synagogue was constructed in a time of change for many of Berlin's Jewish residents. On the one hand, they had finally won full citizenship and often did everything they could to express their loyalty to the Prussian king and to the state to demonstrate their identity as good Prussians and good Germans. This was also taking place during an era in German history in which the Kingdom of Prussia was asserting itself more and more as a dominant force to unify the separate German-speaking states, which would in fact occur a decade later in 1871. On the other hand, commission leaders saw this new synagogue project as a more assertive expression of specifically Jewish worship and identity in the city, based on the premise that synagogues should take their rightful place next to so many other Protestant and Catholic churches in Berlin. It was in this environment that Heimann, the commission leader, spoke in July of 1861. He expressed the wish that the building be, quote, completed for the glory of God and as an ornament to our city. It shall bear witness even after centuries that Israel has not lost its feeling for the reverence and adoration of God, unquote. Yet Heimann also was careful to salute Prussian Emperor Wilhelm I, and in an expression of broader German nationalism, quote, the entire German fatherland, unquote. By March 1866, the interior was largely complete, and this is a view actually from 1888. There are a limited number of interior views, but this one shows a lot of the design features of the so-called Great Hall looking to the east. The interior was complete and featured the most modern gas lighting available. The synagogue, all the way up to its formal dedication in September 1866, continued to be a topic of interest in the city's press. Two particular features of the new synagogue warrant further comment here. In contrast to the old synagogue nearby, the new synagogue commission decided to include a large pipe organ and dedicated choral space. Historians argue that this decision was influenced by mid-19th century liberal reform trends to create a so-called modern religious space which represented a new spirit of Jewish emancipation and also aspiring integration into broader German culture. It was also a nod to the widespread reputation of German church organs and the long tradition of organ building generally in that country. This decision led to substantial disagreement within Berlin's Jewish community. Multiple rabbis were consulted about the admissibility of such an instrument in the worship space. A similar case occurred in France in 1856, when the Council of French Chief Rabbis ruled in favor of the admissibility of organs in French synagogues. Ultimately, the decision was authorized, and the new synagogue installed one of the city's largest and most modern organs, of which there are, as far as I know, almost no pictures, which is really unfortunate. And this became one of the defining features of the new Great Hall. The growing Berlin Jewish press commented in a number of articles on the so-called organ controversy, eventually concluding that, quote, "One must consider the heated emotions on the issue to be out of place. For as the old synagogue will remain without an organ, and the new synagogue will suffice for only part of the community, the supporters of an organ may reserve a place in the latter, and opponents of the same in the former synagogue as they like," unquote. Wasn't quite that easy, but anyway. Worshippers who attended the new synagogue would also increasingly use German texts alongside Hebrew and sing hymns with organ and choral accompaniment. The second notable issue is the appearance and style of the new synagogue as part of the so-called Moorish revival in mid to late 19th century architecture. To be sure, most of the representative structures of this style, both religious and secular, built largely in the United States and Europe, were appropriating elements of Moorish architecture rather than copying it wholesale. Architectural scholars disagree about the sincerity of this adaptation and whether or not it expressed actual admiration for elements of Islamic and North African and Spanish architecture, or whether it was another form of Orientalism, where the West imagined the exotic other in appropriating distinctive non-Western architectural forms, as certainly occurred also with elements of Chinese and other Asian architecture, widespread in Europe back to the 18th century, 17th even. In any case, this style became widespread among new synagogues built in many cities in Central and Eastern Europe in the mid-19th to early 20th century. There's other prominent examples in Dresden, the Semper Synagogue in Dresden, for example. Vienna and Prague also have examples of this. John Ephron, Koret Professor of Jewish History at the University of California, Berkeley, has explained this 19th century architectural trend in Germany and Central Europe as a collective expression of a broader admiration for the so-called golden age of Jewish culture in Moorish Spain. Ephron makes the following argument, quote, "One aspect of the great cultural transformation of German Jewry in 18th and 19th century was the special place of honor it accorded medieval Spanish Jewry during its so-called Golden Age. Especially for the German Jewish elite, the Sephardim were a cultural nobility, and over that span of about 120 years, from approximately 1780 to 1900, what first began among community leaders as an appreciation of Sephardic Jewry blossomed into a rhapsodic and full-blown infatuation with the Jews of Sepharad, worldly, alluring, and cosmopolitan," unquote. Seen in Ephron's interpretation, then, the Moorish revival style of the new synagogue was a sincere part of a broader cultural identity for Berlin's Jewish community. Other scholars have, however, pointed out the delicate balancing act that this architectural style introduced for many German and Central European Jews. On the one hand, they sought to express their unquestioned loyalty to the state and its rulers as loyal and equal citizens. On the other hand, they constantly negotiated how far they might go to express their own identity as a people in a way that did not merely copy existing German architectural forms. Thus, the Moorish revival style can be seen as an expression of difference without any intention to jeopardize the basic premise of Jews' absolute loyalty to the state as citizens. In any case, this style represented a new, fashionable, and modern approach to Jewish identity embodied in its architecture. In sharp contrast to the old synagogue with its modest footprint and North German style, the new synagogue's shining, tall blue and gold dome, rich, bright colors, and ornamentation made a clear statement about the growing confidence of Berlin's Jewish community and its rightful place in the city. Unfortunately, the synagogue's magnificence also provoked leading members of the growing anti-Semitic movement in Germany. Heinrich von Treitschke, a noted German historian, nationalist, and anti-Semite, remarked in 1879, quote, "If one considers the great influence of the Jews on nearly all segments of our society, if one notes the characteristic fact that the most beautiful and splendid house of worship in the German capital is a synagogue, then it virtually cannot be denied that the Jews are more powerful in Germany than in any other Western European country," unquote. Paul Lagarde, another prominent 19th century biblical scholar, Orientalist, and noted anti-Semite, wrote in 1881, quote, "Through the style of their synagogue, the Jews emphasize their alien nature every day in the most obvious manner, though they wish, nevertheless, to enjoy equality with the Germans. What does it mean to claim a right to be the honorable title of a German while you are building your most holy sites in the Moorish style, so that no one can forget that you are a Semite, an Asian, an alien," unquote. In spite of the disparate reactions to this new structure, it would go on to become a centerpiece of Jewish Berlin. And you'll see here a map, and this is from the 1925 census that gives you an idea. If you look basically right in the middle of this map, you will see the district Mitte, M-I-T-T-E, which basically means middle of the city. And this is where both the old and the new synagogue and many other, I'll talk about this in a minute, structures were located. But one of the interesting things that happens in the late 19th and especially into the early 20th century is that Jewish population trends in Berlin tend to move west into affluent neighborhoods of Charlottenburg and Wilmersdorf in the west. And so there's also a history of Jewish residence and settlement patterns in Berlin that change over time. But that heart in Mitte and to a certain extent Prenzlauer Berg, just to the north and east of that, is where much of this is playing out and taking place. Within a 10-minute walk of the Oranienburger Synagogue, one could find the old synagogue that we've talked about already, a noted rabbinical seminary, the Jewish Museum, the Jewish Community Administrative Building, a home for the elderly, and the first Jewish cemetery in Berlin, which was supplemented with a much larger cemetery in the 19th century further out in the Berlin suburbs. The so-called Scheunenviertel, home to mostly recent East European Jewish immigrants, was also close by. Many of Berlin's residents, Jewish residents, lived in this same Mitte, or middle district, where the synagogue was built. In short, the new synagogue anchored the Jewish heart of Berlin well into the 20th century. In addition to serving as the city's largest worship space, the new synagogue would regularly feature important concerts and performances. If you recognize this person in profile from 1930. On one notable occasion in 1930, Albert Einstein and the physician and amateur musician Alfred Lewandowski performed 2 violin duets by Georg Friedrich Händel and Johann Sebastian Bach in the synagogue. Tragically, Berlin's flourishing Jewish life changed dramatically after January of 1933 and the Nazi seizure of power. While the New Synagogue continued to hold worship services until 1940, because of its central location, it also became a center for meetings, a shelter for the persecuted, and a distribution center for growing private assistance as Jews increasingly cared for their own as the Hitler regime turned its back on them. At the same time, the synagogue continued to host concerts and musical performances as a refuge from the terrible changes taking place within German society as a whole. Indeed, the frequency of concerts greatly increased, as all Jewish musicians were ultimately denied access to so-called Aryan performance venues. Without question, one of the turning points in the synagogue's history came on the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938, which has come to be known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Unlike several other Berlin synagogues, which were partially or totally destroyed, there were 14 total, I should add, at the time of Kristallnacht in Berlin, through horrific acts of vandalism and arson, the New Synagogue survived these attacks. When Nazi SA thugs broke into the synagogue that night, they desecrated the Torah scrolls and started a fire which was intended to gut the entire structure. A local precinct police lieutenant, Otto Belgart, stepped in and demanded at gunpoint that the SA leave the building and not take further steps to burn it down, because it was protected as an architecturally significant building, and it was very close to many other private residences which might then also catch fire. This is Belgart's boss. There's a very long and interesting story about this, which I'll only mention briefly. At the same time, his superior, Wilhelm Creutzfeld, pictured in his office here, he was the police chief for the 16th district in which the synagogue was located, arrived with a couple of additional police officers. They successfully summoned the local fire department, who extinguished the still manageable blaze, thus preserving the synagogue with relatively minor interior damage. While Otto Belgart's role in this dramatic defense of the synagogue has only recently come to light, his superior officer, Wilhelm Creutzfeld, has for decades carried the title of the so-called courageous precinct chief. In any case, this remains one of the very few documented interventions by law enforcement to preserve Jewish people, property, and synagogues during the Holocaust. This is very much the exception to what was the rule. In spite of these efforts, the New Synagogue did not survive the war without massive damage. In the face of increasingly intense Nazi persecution, the last religious service took place in March 1940. Shortly after, the building was seized by the German military and converted into a warehouse for uniforms and supply storage. On the basis of more recent archival research into Berlin bomb damage reports, the former house of worship suffered major damage in Allied air raids on Berlin on the 22nd and 26th of November 1943. One of the reports states that, quote, as a result of these raids, the military clothing office was a total loss, unquote. Thus, although it avoided systematic destruction during Kristallnacht, the New Synagogue suffered heavy damage as a result of the war of conquest released on the world by Hitler and his followers. And I'll show you here 5 pictures of the New Synagogue at the end of the war. You can see the substantial damage to the interior space of the Great Hall. You can see that the dome itself survived the war, but was so unstable that it had to be torn down several years after. And much of the heaviest damage to the structure was in the back part of the synagogue in the so-called Great Hall. But none of it escaped without some kind of damage. When Berlin was finally liberated in May of 1945 by the Red Army, only a tiny fraction of the pre-war Jewish population had survived by hiding with sympathetic fellow citizens or passing as non-Jews and constantly living on the margins of urban life. To care for Jewish people who had come out of hiding and survived the battles for Berlin, as well as to work with survivors who were returning from the Nazis' vast camp system, Berlin's recreated Jewish community quickly established offices in various city districts to provide basic logistics and welfare to support the city's survivors. Between 1945 and 46, they formed the officially titled Jewish Community of Berlin, with its first headquarters in the former Community Administrative Building in Oranienburger Straße, number 28, right next to the badly damaged New Synagogue. Their dual task was to create suitable conditions for Jews to reintegrate into German society, for those few who actually wanted to stay, and assist with emigration for the majority who sought to leave Germany. In this chaotic post-war environment where survival and basic life needs took center stage, the Berlin Jewish community could not afford to worry about the state of the New Synagogue, which had once been the iconic symbol of Jewish Berlin. This was further complicated by the worsening political situation in Europe, with a divided Berlin on the front lines of the emerging Cold War. By 1949, the city and the nation as a whole had been divided between East and West Germany. In the face of this political reality, Berlin's Jewish community organization also split into two in 1953. The New Synagogue on Oranienburger Straße fell into communist East Berlin, and this impoverished part of the city had stark choices to make, burdened by paying large reparations ordered by the Soviet occupation authorities, while also trying to rebuild from very heavy wartime damage in the central city. As a result, rebuilding historic structures fell very far down the list of municipal priorities. This was especially true for most religious buildings, especially the ruins of a partially destroyed Jewish synagogue in this newly founded communist state. Therefore, in 1958, the East Berlin city authorities decided to tear down the badly damaged back section of the synagogue, including the massive Great Hall, as it was deemed to be beyond repair. The East Berlin Jewish community issued a formal declaration mourning the loss of the large part of this structure, but stated that, quote, the front portion of the house of worship will be preserved for continuing commemoration and as a reminder for all time, unquote. In fact, the Jewish Community Board only narrowly saved the front portion of this building several years later, when the East Berlin authorities proposed tearing down the entire remaining structure as part of a grand socialist rebuilding of central East Berlin. In September 1966, on the 100th anniversary of the synagogue's dedication, the East Berlin Jewish community raised funds for a plaque to place on the front of the structure. It reads, quote, this synagogue is 100 years old and was set fire to by the Nazis on 9 November 1938 on Kristallnacht. During the Second World War, it was destroyed by air bombardment. The front portion of this house should serve for all time as a site of warning and remembrance. Never forget it, unquote. In spite of these inspiring words from the New Synagogue Centennial, nothing more was done to reinforce or rebuild the remaining front portion of the structure for over 2 decades. It was only in 1988, on the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht, that new life was breathed into this iconic space. The Board of East Berlin's Jewish community arranged with the East Berlin city leadership for the creation of a new Jewish museum and memorial space in the remaining structure to be called the, quote, New Synagogue Berlin, Neue Synagoge Berlin, Centrum Judaicum, unquote. With great fanfare and the participation of East Germany's leader, Erich Honecker, who didn't have that long to go at that point, a symbolic cornerstone laying ceremony for the newly repurposed synagogue building took place on the 9th of November, 1988, the precise date of the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht. This plaque reads, quote, 50 years after the desecration of this synagogue and 45 years after its destruction, this building will rise again at our wish, with the support of many friends in our country and throughout the world, unquote. The new synagogue had thus made a key transition from religious space to museum and monument to Jewish life in Berlin, and a physical warning about the effects of anti-Jewish hatred in German society. What few people could have guessed in November of 1988 is that East Germany itself only had 1 year of life remaining. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in late 1989, the most recent chapter of the new synagogue began to take shape. Seen as an immediate priority for restoration in the newly unified capital city, the new synagogue's full rebirth came under the control of the Berlin Municipal Construction Administration. Here is, I think, a really good example of the type of work that they did in this, in the interior space, basically underneath the dome, the front part of the synagogue. You see the old section and then the fully restored section there. They would first clear all remaining rubble and debris, then reinforce and restore the inner and outer remaining front structure so that it could eventually be opened as a museum to the public. Reinforcing the front structure would also allow for the recreation, according to historical plans, of the Great Dome, which had been badly damaged and later torn down. Within only a couple of years after reunification, the synagogue's facade had been completely renovated, and the massive blue and gold dome once again took its place of prominence in central Berlin's skyline. It has again become a key feature of the city as it once was in the 19th and early 20th century. The new museum and memorial space remains a popular tourist destination with a permanent collection and rotating exhibits on a wide range of subjects related to Jewish history, culture, and religion in Berlin and Germany. Finally, in 1998, which you can see here in this screenshot, a newly rededicated Oranienburger Straße synagogue was established in a third-floor room of the original building's front hall. Again, the Great Hall and the entire worship space was gone, but this reestablished synagogue in 1998 took place in a much smaller space in the front part. It still welcomes worshipers to this day. The new synagogue's rebirth thus brings to a positive conclusion the building's long, complex, and sometimes tragic history. While many other synagogues in Berlin and Germany did not survive Kristallnacht or the war, at least part of the physical structure of the new synagogue remained in a post-1945 state that did not generally look favorably on partially destroyed religious structures. From its origin, as the symbol of a growing and more confident Jewish population in Germany's largest city, to its near total destruction and survival and rebirth in the post-World War II period, Berlin's new synagogue offers us many compelling stories, not only about the structure itself, but also about the survival of the people and community that made it possible in the first place. Thank you for listening this evening to just a few of those stories. And if you're interested, there are two of the two books on the outside you can see are in English. The one in the middle is not translated in German. Unfortunately, that's probably the best single volume on the synagogue itself. But if you're interested, you can take a picture of the screen and you can find these in a local library or order them. At least the one on the left by Andreas Nakama is available, I know, on Amazon. So, yeah, here.
Where did the funding come for the original synagogue?
So there's there's a very interesting story to that. They had budgeted about $200,000 a total budget of 200,000 marks. It ended up costing 800,000. So there were, needless to say, massive cost overruns, and all of this was privately funded by Berlin's Jewish community. So there was no government or urban private partnership. It was entirely funded by the community. Yeah, Alan, and then back here. Yeah.
Under the communists, were they allowed to worship?
So this is also a very interesting question. There's a whole history. So the Jewish community in East Germany was very, very small. There was only one in the entire country for the entire duration of its existence, from 49 to 89, 40 years. There was only one entirely new synagogue that was built in all of East Germany, and that was in Erfurt, Germany, where they allowed for construction of a new synagogue in 1950. There was some work later on. There was a whole sort of campaign around the time in the 1980s in Berlin specifically to celebrate Berlin's own 750th anniversary. So there was a sudden interest in trying to rebuild structures in East Berlin of historic importance, because much of central Berlin fell within the communist eastern part of the city. So there's a very interesting history to that. The very short answer to your question is yes, they were, but you can also see in the records of the Stasi, the East German secret police, and other government records, they had an entire section that was responsible for, in effect, spying on people of all allowed religious beliefs, Christians and Jews. So they were also monitored and they were also persecuted, but they were technically, yes, allowed to worship in those spaces. Yeah?
How many Jews were there in Germany prior to World War II, and how many Jews are in Germany at the present time?
Also a great question. The first part of your question is scholars don't fully agree. The general number that has been settled on is around 550,000 if you talk about Germany in its entirety. In Berlin, this will give you some idea of the size of the Jewish population of Berlin. The Jewish population of Berlin alone was about 180,000 in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, okay? The problem is, one of the things that happens over the course of the 19th century is almost a steady upline, if you look at it, of intermarriage. And so one of the issues becomes, the way that historians look at this question is, who do we identify from what perspective, in other words, in terms of total numbers, and how do we account? But the general number is about 550,000. There are now about, and this is at the last count that I saw, about 80 to 85,000 in Germany. That number was much smaller than that at the end of World War II. And what has accounted for the growth, so for example, in Berlin, the Adas Israel Synagogue, which is actually not terribly far from this, is very heavily influenced by Russian immigrants that came in after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that infusion after the end of communism in Eastern Europe has grown those numbers over the last 30 years substantially. But we're talking about between immigration, those Jewish families and individuals and children that were able to get out before the final solution really took hold. And then, of course, the several 100,000 who were murdered as a result of German Jews that were murdered, German and Austrian Jews that were murdered as a result of the Holocaust, meant that those numbers were disastrously reduced. Yeah, yeah.
So technically, the Jewish population has grown and is approaching what it was pre-war, but culturally they're quite a bit different than.
That is correct. That is correct. And that is, I mean, there are many things. Berlin, in many ways, is the kind of iconic center of liberal and reform Judaism in Germany. I mean, the new synagogue is probably the best example of that. I mean, with the organ and with increasing use of German language text alongside Hebrew. So that sort of status of Berlin is a bit different now. It's not to say that there are not, I mean, again, then this also gets us into the entire discussion about how we think of people who have immigrated to Germany. Germany is also dealing with the whole question of migrants and what it actually means to be German, which is a broader question going on as well. And when there were, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's a very interesting and somewhat unfortunate story, not only specifically about Jews, but so-called Russian Germans who ethnically claimed actual German ancestry all the way back to the 18th century, to the time of Catherine the Great, showed back up in Germany when the Soviet Union collapsed. So the identity of Berlin and Germany's Jews today is also caught up in part of a larger debate about what it means to be German, which is an interesting question. Yeah.
Because this is going to be a Jewish synagogue, and it's going to have a prominent structure in the city,
Yeah.
does the government require an extra vote on that beyond anything of the regular building permits?
Do you mean when it was originally constructed?
Yes, the 1866 or whatever this
No,
is.
because they had already had precedent for building with the old synagogue, the original synagogue that had been built. So aside from the zoning for religious spaces and everything else, there was nothing beyond that that had to be gained because it was a synagogue in particular.
They weren't going to take an extra, because this is a Jewish synagogue, they're not going to do a special vote on the side or something.
No. No.
If you go back 100 years before World War I,
Right.
I guess in Europe in general, what percentage of the Jewish community are city dwellers, actually in cities, and what are this outlying, if that makes sense, outlying country people?
It absolutely does. And in fact, the author of this first book, Andreas Nakama, has written about this. So if you look at, and it also varies by country. If we take Germany, which is the subject of tonight's discussion, and also Austria, you see a massive shift of Germany and Austria's Jewish population over the course of the 19th century into cities. It is substantial. They begin the 19th century. Now, again, this is also, we need to think about this in terms of Germany's overall population, which also shifts from being predominantly rural and agricultural at the beginning of the 19th century and becomes overwhelmingly urban. Berlin specifically is an interesting case. Berlin by far, by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, had by far, I mean, twice as much, more than twice as much, it might have been even close to 3 times as much as the next largest city, which was Hamburg, Jewish population in Berlin. And when you look at that transition that has taken place, it is actually part of a larger trend because Berlin itself, Berlin was often referred to as being newer than Chicago. Mark Twain and others who visited this city, Berlin was, so a lot of the sort of central and especially western, like in the Rhineland and other parts of Germany, were seen as more of the old historic Germany. Berlin was seen as this very modern, restless city that was very much a sort of symbol of modernity within Germany. And so there is also something that goes on, which I did not talk about tonight, but there is also a particular focus on Berlin itself, especially by anti-Semites into the 20th century. And they claim that Jews are attracted to Berlin because of its modern, fast-paced nature, and they're able to basically sort of exist in this world better than they can in the slower, sleepier, quintessentially German cities. So there's a sort of anti-Semitic trope that goes along with that. But
If I could just have
yeah,
one, I apologize for dominating. Today's Europe, which cities are the most welcoming and receptive to the Jewish community in today's Europe?
well,
Not the right question.
so I will say this, and because it takes us a little bit far away from the topic of tonight's talk, without wading too much in that direction. One of the interesting things that has happened, I would say, you could, for example, argue that Hungary is. But Hungary has its own political issues in relation to the EU and other things. But you get out into rural Hungary, and that's not necessarily the case. I think, generally speaking, it is fair to say that Germany in its attempt to, there's this very long German word that talks about coming to terms with the past, basically trying to confront the crimes of Nazism and what Germany did and make good on that process. I would say that certainly Germany has done as well, if not better, than many other European countries in embracing and making and spaces for and reestablishing icons of Jewish culture, ironically in some ways, given this very difficult history. But one of the things and I won't say too much here, we need to remember something. When we think about Nazism and the Third Reich, absolutely, and the Holocaust, so for many people we think Germans and Jews, it's absolutely, this is the home of the Holocaust. If we move back before 1933 and you look at the experience of Jews in Germany in terms of their integration, in terms of their success, Germany was one of the most integrated of European countries in terms of Jewish life. So there's a very kind of complex history there because it depends on periodization. It depends when we think about it. So I will say, in spite of that though, if you travel to Berlin, and this is not only true of the New Synagogue, but others, you will see security barriers and 24-hour police presence in front of the New Synagogue and others. They will check your bags when you go into the museum and so forth. So there is an awareness on that front, but that's hardly only the case for Berlin. It's the case in many other places. But again, that takes us away from the topic of the, question here.
Yeah, several years ago I was in Prague,
Yep.
and in the Jewish section
Yep.
there, and one of the tour guides was telling us that the Jewish synagogues could not be built any taller than any Christian synagogues. Was that the same there?
Did you see the old synagogue that I showed you? That is exactly what the proscription was at the time that it was built. And even the new synagogue, when it was built, there were other Lutheran and Catholic churches that were taller. So that is absolutely correct in terms of code.
The other thing was, also in Prague, it was the Jewish synagogues could not be standalone. They were between other buildings.
Well, that was the case here.
That saved some of them because
That is why, largely, this is the argument that Otto Belgart, the police officer who went in there and drove the SA out, one of the arguments he made was that, first of all, it was protected architecturally, the structure, but it was connected to all the nearby residential buildings. Now, if you look at some of the photos of burning synagogues, this did not stop every case. So in smaller towns where stand-alone synagogues were burned, many of them were destroyed. There are the Fasanenstrasse synagogue in Berlin, for example, there are others that were destroyed that were also near other structures. But in some cases, that was the case, and with the new synagogue, that absolutely was the case.
excuse me, but I also saw, it's probably the oldest one there in Prague, where they did go down further.
Yep. And that's exactly what they did with the old synagogue that I showed you earlier. Yeah.
Back to your topic. When it was operating, how was it supported? Was it supported by a dues structure, like you have real synagogues, or was it all by donations of the Catholic?
That is a good question. I can't tell you with certainty. I would imagine that would have been the pattern that maintained it, but that specific piece of information in terms of maintenance and its overall overall sort of maintenance financing, I'm not entirely sure about that. But that's an interesting question. I would assume that was the structure. Yeah.
Between, I think it was 1966 and 1988, like the interest in kind of like reviving the synagogue, you said died down. Is there like a reason that it took so long for them to do it, or that's just, it was what it was?
So, generally speaking, and this is a really good question, sort of the high point of East Germany kind of know this a little bit, right? The high point of East, so in the early 1970s, Erich Honecker takes over, the head of East Germany that showed up, that was there for the creation of this memorial plaque on the front of the synagogue. He initiates, among other things, a massive new rebuilding program, but the rebuilding program is focused on housing, basically. There's this huge program that stretches through the 70s. And East Germany is constantly strapped for currency reserves. It's constantly in need of money. It's providing huge high-level stipends to food, to almost everything you can imagine to keep prices artificially low. And where the new construction is really going to happen, what they wanted to focus on, because the population was fairly steady and had begun to inch up after it had dipped before the wall was built, is to focus on new places for people to live. That was the primary focus. So if you had any money to go into construction, the vast majority of that went into new apartment buildings and other structures. Very, very little was done. And I will add, there's a very long list of other iconic buildings, Lutheran and Catholic churches, that were not in bad shape at all. Had they ended up in West Germany, they absolutely would have been preserved and brought back, that the East German government simply torn down. This happened, for example, with a very famous Lutheran church, the University Church in the East German city of Leipzig, that was largely intact, and that was torn down, was dynamited actually by the East German authorities. So there's a very problematic relationship between the state. Part of that is ideology, that these are religious structures and we're trying our best to kind of wean you off of religion generally. But part of it is simply a money issue, that if you're going to invest money, it's going to go into housing for people, because East Germany was never fully able to resolve basic issues like housing without massive costs. It changes a little bit in Berlin because they're coming up on at the time, the 750th anniversary of Berlin's. So they actually do. There's a very interesting, which we don't have time for tonight, history of the way in which the East Berlin municipal authorities redid parts of like the Nikolai Quarter, for example, in Berlin, that they tried to make it kind of history-ish looking, and it's done with the same kind of concrete plates that there's a whole interesting history to that. But it's a good question. It's money, and it's also the kind of ideological thing that if we had the resources to do it, we certainly aren't going to spend our money on religious buildings.